Hi, I'm Sky High Phoenix, a game developer and game design student at the University of Portsmouth, and this is an entry into my development log from my studies. Namely, this one is looking at a post-mortem for the first game jam I have done as part of my game development module. Now, to understand a bit about what I'm talking about here, we will first need to talk about the brief. Simply put, we got 2 weeks, 2 people, and we're allowed 1 input into our game. That's it. Go make a game. And this is the second assignment. Yeah, bit daunting, but it's something we have to do. So, of course, when you get to the stage, you're at the start of university, you find your partner, and or teammate, however you want to call it, and you're trying to figure out what the hell you're doing. So, of course, you start with a bit of ideation. And in our case, that was essentially 2 pages in a notebook. One which was saying, okay, it's a hyper casual single input game. What different concepts do we have? And in the end, we ended up with this thing that you can see on your screen just on the far side, which is the situation where we have a door, which your input controls by toggling it either open or closed, and you're trying to avoid killing the king who sits behind it. And, of course, why would the king die? Because there's some visitors that are coming past. Friendly ones, you've got to allow the public to see their monarch, of course, but there are some more nefarious things. Think your stereotypical, very cartoon-esque villain with, like, coat, big knife, that kind of thing. And it is very much just a hyper-casual game where you're just opening and closing the door to get as high a score as you can. Now, for this project, despite being a designer, I mainly focused on some logic and some code. Again, when you've got 2 people and you're trying to split your subject specialisms between who knows how to do some art for assets and who knows how to do some technical coding, or who might have the best shot at it, in the end, some of the other stuff, the design, you're not really going to have much other than that initial ideation within this time frame. But for the code, I ended up doing some C++. And you'll notice, very object-oriented, all the logic is in there for the different methods, looking at it by the door, what needs to be done for the king, what needs to be done for the different visitor types. Speaking of, looking at the next slide, we have some different bits of inheritance for the different visitor types. Your civilian, the ones you're allowed in, and your 3 essentially bad guys in the different lose conditions. Why we decided to go for 3? Yeah, that was a bit of not knowing how to scope things yet. We were way too ambitious with that, and it is just, but ultimately the logic is mostly the same, but on the art side that would have had a lot of extra stuff that needed to be done. Again, we're just starting university with this project. We don't really know how to set projects up to that correct scoping yet for this kind of scale, but this is what we got. And then we have all the game logic. Yes, I have just thrown 3 slides worth of just code up, but it's what I did. And as you might notice, it is very much not C++ based in terms of thinking style. My background in coding has come mainly from Python, and then looking at some specific coding for custom modules. For example, I have done some work on a custom camera module for a university for my computer science A-level. But what we see here is very much, okay, from my background in computer science, what am I able to code up here as it is in this sense? And the game logic here is very much just a bunch of checks. Has the enemy or has the visitor reached the point where we need to check it? Is the door open? Is the door closed? Do we need to kill the king in the game? And or has a civilian got there to the king, and therefore we can increment score? And therefore, what process are we doing? Are we continuing the game loop? You'll also notice that I have a game class and an active game class. just made sense to do it that way in this case. And of course, as much as you've got game logic, you need to run the game. Otherwise, how's that logic going to be used? And this is the execution loop. It's not the nicest thing to look at, but it by far isn't too complex. It's just a bunch of references to the different elements of the logic and just knowing which ones to go into which order. Maybe it should be more event-based. Admittedly, I wasn't really understanding of how to do that at this stage, but it's something I've come across before, but I wasn't going to set up custom events for this one in the time that we had. So, ultimately from the coding perspective, as a developer, this is my previous experience. It very much does play to some of the strengths that I had bringing into the course, but of course, being more computer science focused, I haven't got that exact experience with engines, for example. So there are some things that you might notice, namely the fact that it is not coded for Unreal Engine 5, despite the fact that that was the engine we're using. A number of points in the code, as I say, events for 1, 2, how it's declared, not based on the UE5 standard for C++ coding. Admittedly, I didn't know that was a thing at this point. I had just assumed I can code this up and then throw it into the engine later. That was naive, but it doesn't hook in any of the art as well. Admittedly, my teammate had said, okay, I can do some basic art, and because I have enough understanding of the coding that they had enough understanding of the coding, they could do some as well. But that was a thing where I was like, okay, I need to get my code out so that they can hook it in. And then, of course, you have some small logical errors in there. If you look through the entire code, you might spot them if you want to go back in the video and stop there on the different sides, but ultimately it was nothing critical in this case. It's just when you're trying to execute this kind of game, there's a couple of things in there that you probably would want to tweak on the logic side. Now, of course, this is a lot of what I've done in terms of the hard coding element of it. But there's also the fact that I was in a team, and therefore my work is not the only thing. And at this stage, you don't really know how to have collaborative documents for all this stuff, so it's more about how you merge the work. Yeah. This kind of happened. Bearing in mind, that's 3 AM on the day that it's meant to be in. So we had not too much. Now, admittedly, turns out that I found out later on that there's been some stuff that had been going on in the background, and because it isn't formally assessed towards the grade, no EC applications at this point, but it is that kind of situation where you get to 3 AM on the due date, and your teammate says, yeah, haven't done anything. It's annoying, but you have to deal with it, and if anything, it just means that there's more of this that needs to be learnt, namely people skills. And when you're working in a team, this is probably the biggest thing that you have to adapt for that team. So, from what I learned here was, because maybe it was partially to do with the fact that everyone's learning uni, but how to uni, but there was definitely not enough communication in that first week, and we only as a group got to the situation where we were talking about what we were doing, where we were at in the second week, and even then it was just Discord messages, and that was very much, okay, here's what I have at the moment, here's when I'm expecting to get stuff out. There wasn't really much understanding of what the situation was or communication about, okay, this is why I'm thinking that I'm going to be able to get it by this date and what may obstruct it, for example. The other thing I've learned is just check in more often. I didn't really check too far in as to, okay, I didn't instigate some sort of ideas of, can I know where you're at so that I know what I need to hook in or anything. It was very much a, okay, I'll do one bit, they'll do the other bit. That won't work in the teams in the future. The other thing is, I have to lower my expectations at this point, because I've obviously come in based on what we've said, and sort of set a bar for myself of, okay, this is where I expect the standard to be. It's shooting too high for what we're doing, or at least within the time frame. So that is the other thing. Maybe it's also to factor in things like, okay, we're starting uni, or people have lives outside of uni, surprisingly, and that's also going to mean that you won't necessarily get that standard that you may initially think, and that was something that definitely I had to internalize pretty early on. But it just is the situation of, I also have high standards. For first years, I've got to lower them, including for myself, sorry. But then again, that is sort of the basics of, okay, you're dealing with teams, you've got to learn people, and you've got to learn how to adapt to that team's situation and what's going to work to ensure that you can get progress on with that team. Ultimately, what we did get though was this submitted. It's mainly just the code that I got with a couple little extra bits, but it's not a working game, as you can see from the description. It's mainly just a logic. However, we got something in on time. And again, it's not graded, so it isn't too much a worry, particularly when one of the points of these game jams is to fail faster and fail in a way that allows you to learn how to be a better developer. And in this case, there was a lot in terms of, okay, this is what it means to go into a project. And to get something handed in is worth it. Again, lessons learned. Standards too high. This is just something that has plagued me for so long, and it is something that I need to work on. And then, the complexity of the game needs to be dropped. Scoping was completely out with what we had initially thought. As I say, there's logic in there for 3 different types of bad guys. The art complexity on that thing would have taken way too long for a 2-week project. At least within the context of what we were looking at. And then looking into the specifics of the engine. I only learned this after the project, but as I say, I didn't know that UE5 had a weird set of how it hooks into C++, but then again, I just made a bad assumption there. And this is something that, when I learned later on, this is something that, if I want to do any kind of coding, I will need to learn specifics. Because, okay, just because it's a language doesn't mean you can just use that language everywhere without changing it. And also, just the basic thing of have more frequent contact with the team. Know where you're at, know what needs to change, know how to rescope. It is a basic set of things, but it's 2 weeks and the first assignment. You can't really get much more out of it unless you're already succeeding and you're looking at tweaking smaller things. But just at the basic level of understanding, that is what I got. And really, that's it. It was a short project, but one that really sort of set the tone for things in terms of, no, this is what it means to make games. I don't have necessarily that background, but to bring that in and know and get that bit of experience, even if it's at the start, is definitely helpful. And ultimately, well, you'll have to wait and see for the next update whether that really translates into anything, because there's multiple game jams to go, let alone some of the other modules, but for this one, it worked well, enough at least, and it's got some stuff to take forward. That's the key thing. Anyway, till next time.